This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, welcome everyone. Shalom Aleichem, Bruchim Habayim. Welcome to Shimru's International Shabbos Project, or something like that. That's what it's called. So Shabbos 39, keep it. All of the good names. Welcome everybody. We have a very nice representation today. All the way we have our friend from Atlit and England, and now, somebody asked me last time, the Shiurim are very good, but can we have some Tochein in the Shiur? So that's exactly what we're doing this week. This week the Shiur is on Tochein, grinding. How do you know? I take my criticism very seriously. And Tochein, grinding, which is the seventh malacha. Actually, we skipped Tochein. We went to Merakid last week, which was number 8. We skipped number 7. So next week will be Lush. Now, where was Tochein used in the Mishkan? Well, in the Mishkan, you had the herbs that were going to be used for the dye, and they were ground into a powder. And then that powder was mixed with water to produce a thick paste. So the grinding process of the pestle and the mortar, that was the malacha of Tochein. So we're going to discuss today what constitutes Tochein. There's an entire branch of halacha that we're not really going to be able to get into, and that is the use of medication on Shabbos, which falls under the category of grinding. And we'll explain in a moment. The Rambam says in Hilchos Shabbos, Parak Ches Halacha Tezvav, one who grinds the size of a dried fig is chayev. So anyone who grinds, says the Rambam, spices, tavelin, v'samonin, or herbs, b'machteshes, with a mortar, hareza tochein, v'chayev. That's the av. The av is to grind spices, herbs in a mortar, or any kind of usual instrument. What is the tolda? The tolda is, you see, you're taking, let's say, grain, the kernel. The kernel is not usable. You can't make bread out of a kernel. You need to make flour. So you need to crush the kernel into flour. So let's say you have a vegetable, you have a carrot, and you want to, slice and dice it. So in effect, you're grinding. You're making very small pieces. So one who grinds a vegetable, which is harvested, that's a tolda of Tochein. So you're saying, well, what do? I like to have my Israeli salad. Okay, good. That's why you should buy it before Shabbos. But you can't make it on Shabbos, because to cut it into very small pieces is Tochein. So what if, so therefore we're going to learn when you make a salad, you should cut it into larger chunks on Shabbos. On Shabbos you're going to have American salad, Russian salad, not Japanese salad. You can have Saudi Arabian salad, but don't have Israeli salad on Shabbos until, the small little cucumbers or the small little tomatoes, unless you make before. I don't like it when it's cut up before. It's very mushy. Pal, that's why go straight to the cholent. What do you need the salad for? You have gefilte fish and cholent. There's no room for salad. You don't need the salad. You need salad, do the lettuce, obviously checked. You could have put in the cherry tomatoes, but you don't need that fine salad on Shabbos. Fine. Or if you chop wood to use the sawdust, that is Tochein. Or one who files metal, you're chayev if you even file a little bit. That is the tolda. These are all the iraisa. So your Israeli salad, again, is getting into issues of Tochein da iraisa. How about taking medication on Shabbos? Say, taking medication on Shabbos, what could be problematic with taking medication on Shabbos? Well, there is a Isser D'Rabbanan of taking medicine on Shabbos, because in the olden days, the way they produced medicine is they ground herbs. So Chazal did not want somebody to come to produce medication on Shabbos, and therefore they prohibited the taking of medication on Shabbos. Now, obviously, if somebody needs to take it for a life-threatening situation, it's mutter. Furthermore, if somebody needs to take it for an illness, that if they don't take it, they would be confined to a bed. They would be choyle kol gufay, or their whole body would hurt. So if somebody would be nafal lemishkav, somebody would have to go into bed, or somebody is choyle kol gufay, they're permitted to take medication on Shabbos. But if somebody merely has what is called mechush ba'alma, a small ailment, one has a minor headache, one has a minor toothache, and so then one would not be able to treat it on Shabbos. One cannot treat minor ailments. And now, let's say somebody has a mild infection, but it's a strep, or it's something that you have to take antibiotics for. So generally we conclude that one is permitted to take antibiotics on Shabbos, because if you don't take it, it could end up being a life-threatening situation or a serious issue. Or if somebody needs to take medication because their limb is in jeopardy, that's also permitted. But mechush ba'alma, it's just a minor ailment, we don't take medication on Shabbos. Now, what if it's a minor ailment, but you know this is the kind of headache that if you don't treat it now, it will be a full-blown migraine in 3 hours, and you will have to lie down. So then you're also allowed to take medicine. There is an opinion, and I'm not saying this is definitive because not everybody agrees to it, that you're allowed to take preemptive medication. In other words, right now you feel perfect, but you have this twinge in your head that you know a headache is coming on. Now, the headache that's coming on is only a minor ailment. There are those who say you're allowed to take medication for preventative medicine. That is the opinion of Rabbi Ribiat. Many disagree with that. Again, if you know a headache is coming on, that you'll be nafal lemishkav, and you'll have to go to sleep, and you have to lie down, you for sure can take medication. But if you just know something's coming on, now why would you be allowed to take preemptive medication for a minor ailment? The answer is, the logic is, and again, this is not unanimously held, many disagree with this, but the logic is, why don't we allow you to take medication? Because we're afraid that if we allow you to take medication, if you don't have it in stock, you'll produce it yourself. You'll grind up the herbs. We're afraid you're going to do that if you're in a state of bahala, where you have a pressing need because your head hurts or you're not feeling well. So we're afraid that you're under the bahala, you're going to produce the medication. However, if it's preemptive, and you're not really under the pressure to produce it, we're not really concerned you're going to come to produce it, and therefore there is perhaps room for leniency. That should be discussed with your local, personal paisik. Okay, let us now see the Gemara. The Gemara in Shabbos on Ayin Dalet Amud Beis. The Gemara discusses.
Excuse me, nobody grinds today their medicine. It comes in tablet form or it comes in liquid form, so it's not applicable today. So surely, therefore, that should not apply. One should be allowed to take it in any event.
Okay, thank you for that question. Very important. Who is that? I recognize your voice, but I don't see your picture.
David.
David, how are you? What's your last name again?
Kale.
Okay, so that's a very important question, because it would seem that the whole concern is obsolete. Nobody produces medication from herbs today. You know, you get yourself you have a little bottle of Tylenol, Advil, and so it seemed the whole concern of the Chachamim is obsolete. However, this decree of the rabbis is still in full force. And that is because when the rabbis tell us to avoid something, even if the reason given in the Talmud does not seem to apply anymore, nevertheless, one of the ideas is they've only revealed to us one of possibly thousands of reasons of why they forbid this type of activity. So even if to our minds it's no longer relevant and it's obsolete, the decree still stands. However, your point is well taken in that Rav Asher Weiss does differentiate between rabbinic law where the reason does apply and rabbinic law where the reason does not apply. Namely, that under normal circumstances there is no difference. Whether we think it applies or it doesn't apply, we still have to abide by the law. However, in cases of doubt, there is more room for leniency on rabbinic law where the reason does not apply. Okay, so your point is well taken, and it does make a difference. But under regular scenarios, if one knows that they have a minor ailment, a minor headache, and they could certainly wait till after Shabbos to take the Advil, and they'll deal with it, that's certainly the correct, the required course of action. But there are, in more borderline cases, there's more room for leniency in rabbinic law where the reason does not apply. Okay, let us move on. The Gemara says on Shabbos, Ayin Daled Amud Beis, Amar Papa, Haiman de pare silka, chayiv mishum tochein. One who chops beets is chayiv for grinding. Amar Rav Menashe, Haiman de salisa silte, chayiv mishum tochein. Rav Menashe said, someone who cuts wood into chips is chayiv for grinding. Now the question is, why is the Gemara talking about beets? I mean, who eats beets? You maybe you have chrein. Who eats beets? Why doesn't the Gemara talk about peppers? Bananas, I don't know. Why didn't the Gemara talk about celery? What's beets? So, from this Gemara we see that the definition of grinding is bringing things into smaller pieces. So let's say you grind kernels of wheat into flour, you break the kernels down into pieces, or you cut vegetables into small pieces. So based on this Gemara, one would think in all circumstances, when you cut something into small pieces, that's Tochein. However, comes the Ritva, and the Ritva quotes Rabbeinu Yoina that the prohibition of cutting vegetables into small pieces is only if it's inedible, if it's raw. A food inedible in its current state, then and only then are you chayiv for grinding it. But if it's edible, like a piece of bread, and now you want to chop up your bread into tiny little pieces, it's permitted because it's already edible. So the Ritva is of the opinion, quoting Rabbeinu Yoina, that the Isser of Tochein only applies in a circumstance where it is inedible. So a beet is inedible raw. And now that you chop it up, it is more edible, let's say. We'll see. And that's when Tochein applies. But if you would want to cut an apple into tiny little pieces, or a cucumber into tiny little pieces, or a tomato into tiny little pieces, it would be mutter according to the Ritva and Rabbeinu Yoina. The Rambam says as follows: one who cuts the vegetable, the Rambam is in Parak Chafal Halacha Yud Ches, one who cuts the vegetable very, very thin to cook it, that's a tolda of Tochein. The Rambam adds, you're cutting the vegetable extremely thin. And then the Rambam says in Parak Zayin Halacha, hey, one who cuts a vegetable to cook it, you're chayiv, it's a tolda of tchina, because tchina is taking one entity and dividing it into small parts. The Rambam seems to say that the Isser of Tochein applies if you're doing it for the sake of cooking. That implies you're only chayiv for slicing and dicing if it's going to be cooked. Says the Kesef Mishnah, the Rambam understands that the reason why the Gemara talks about beets is not because beets cannot be eaten raw. The reason the Gemara talks about beets, according to the Rambam, is because beets are cut up finely to cook it. So according to the Rambam, you're only chayiv for Tochein if you're going to cook it. Says the Kesef Mishnah, on the other hand, it could be the Rambam holds that even foods that are eaten raw, if you're going to cut it into small pieces for cooking, that's also aser. So
cutting small pieces for cooking on Shabbos. Nobody cooks on Shabbos.
Maybe you're doing it for after Shabbos.
But then you have the question of the Achar Shabbos.
Okay, that's a minor problem, and compared to Tochein, which is an Isser D'Oraisa.
Rabbi, I know we have elderly people who have difficulty consuming, larger pieces, swallowing issues.
That's why they should get chocolate milkshakes before Shabbos.
So if I want to cut up a vegetable into smaller pieces, or someone who has difficulty consuming it, who's larger, would I be open?
We'll come to that. So right now we have two opinions. We have the opinion of the Ritva and Rabbeinu Yoina that cutting something up is only a problem if it if it cannot be eaten raw. The Rambam adds that cutting something up is prohibited if it's done for the sake of cooking. However, the Ureim comes and says you should not cut vegetables into small pieces, period. Beets is an example. It doesn't matter, you do eat it raw, you don't eat it raw. You cannot cut anything into small pieces. So if you cut something into small pieces, according to the Ureim, it is an Isser D'Oraisa. So it would come out like this. To cut tomatoes and cucumbers into small pieces, according to the Ritva and Rabbeinu Yonah, you can eat it raw. It's mutter. According to the Rambam, you're not cutting it to cook it. It's mutter. According to the Ureim, it's prohibited. Comes the Rajba, and the Rajba says, furthermore, even if you're not cutting it into small pieces, you can't cut up a vegetable. However, says the Rajba, immediately prior to eating it, you're allowed to cut it up. Big or small. Says the Rajba, the Torah never asked you to start, don't eat it this size, eat it that size. I'm about to eat something, I'll eat it the size I want to eat it. According to the Rajba, immediately prior to eating, you're allowed to cut something even to a very small size. In advance of eating, you can't even cut it into bigger chunks. Okay, now here's a question, how do we paskin? The Beis Yosef says, we are machmir on all 4 shitais. Which means, number 1, you can't cut up something that cannot be eaten raw, that you're cutting so that it's more edible. You cannot cut something up to cook. You cannot cook something. You can't cut something into small pieces, and you can't cut something into even larger chunks well in advance of eating. So, the bottom line is, if you want to make a salad, then you need to do the following 2 things. If you want to make Israeli salad, it's going to be chunky. It's going to be big pieces of cucumbers and bigger pieces of tomatoes. And you do it right before the meal. You can't, you have these people, they have a lot of anxiety, and they start preparing like 3 hours before the meal, and they like to have their salad ready, and then they go to shul. Can't do that. Don't cut up your salad and then go to shul. So you said, but then I'm not going to have my salad. Like I said before, the main Oineg Shabbos is the cholent, not the salad. In my house, they bring out the salad, and everyone else takes the salad, and I take the cholent. That's my personal...
You're the exception that proves the rule.
That's my personal rule and recommendation. But the bottom line is, if you want to make the salad, don't cut it up too fine, and don't cut it up in advance of the meal. What about, now we get to the lamdas. A little bit more lamdas, and then I'm going to come to a very interesting machlokes between Rav Moshe and the Chazon Ish. Are you allowed to cut up onions into small pieces for a salad? Now, onions, they're edible raw, right? You could eat an onion raw. It's not typically eaten raw, but you definitely cut up onions to put in small pieces of an onion to put into a salad. Let's think about the definition of the malacha for a moment. The malacha, in a way, involves 2 components. The first component is you take a larger item and you cut it up into smaller items. For example, you take kernels of grain. Now, you can't make flour out of kernels of grain, so you're going to slice and dice the kernel, and now you have flour. You can't make dough from a kernel. Okay, so in reality, you've done 2 things. Number 1, by cutting up the kernel, you've taken a large item and you made it small items. But number 2, you've created a substance that now could be used that in its earlier state, it could not be used. Listen carefully. 2 things are being accomplished by Tochein. Number 1, you have a kernel, you have a beet. The kernel is large, then you cut it up into 500 particles. And secondly, now you have something that's usable. Beforehand, the kernel could not be produced into flour, and now the kernel could be made into flour. So the question is, which element of Tochein is the primary element? Is it taking a large item and breaking it up into small item? Or is it taking an entity that was unusable and rendering it into a new entity which is now usable? Is it taking an entity that was unusable, rendering it usable, or is it breaking something up into small particles? Now, the Sefer Yereim, who says that cutting up any vegetable into small particles is a problem, suggests from Tzvi Kushalevsky, it holds that the primary aspect of Tochein is breaking something up into small particles. Regardless of whether you're making it more usable or less usable, the primary element of Tochein, according to the Sefer Yereim, is taking a large entity and breaking it up into small entities. The Ritva and the Rambam, on the other hand, they hold that you're chayiv if what you're producing is something that is more usable. Now you could cook it. Now you could do something with it. So according to the Yereim, whenever you cut something into small pieces, you're chayiv. And according to the Ritva, it's only if, it's not generally eaten raw, so now it's edible, or now it's cookable. So the argument could be made that if you're going to cut onions into very small pieces, while according to the Sefer Yereim, that would maybe be problematic, according to the Rambam, you perhaps would not be able to do it because beforehand, in the state the onion is in, nobody is biting out of a raw onion. But sliced and diced, you're creating a new entity. So maybe the Rambam would say that this is somewhat problematic. The bottom line is that when it comes to cutting an onion into small pieces, one should not cut them too small. And furthermore, here's an interesting machlokes between Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Nissen Karelitz. What is the definition of too small? You know, when we say don't cut your salad too small, how do you define too small? So Rav Shlomo Zalman has a lenient criteria of determining what is considered too small. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman, he says, Tzarech loimer, the timer shemuter, lachtech v'shavos peres yiragas gedolim l'chatichas katan shurus miyad l'achila, u'mnei shadayin tzrichim l'shinayim ha'tochen oisoisan. The reason is, says the Rav Shlomo Zalman, is if you're still going to need your teeth to chew it, that's big enough. So you say, that pretty much still allows me to do anything because if I'm still going to need my teeth, I'm not obviating the need for chewing, then that kind of slicing and dicing is permitted. On the other hand, Rav Nissen Karelitz disagrees, and he says, anytime cutting it up into a smaller piece makes it easier to eat, that would not be permitted. So regarding the question before, are you allowed to cut up a vegetable into small pieces for an old person to help them eat it on Shabbos, even right before they eat, that should be avoided. You could cut up chicken, you could cut up eggs, you could cut up other things. To cut up vegetables, that could be an issue of Tochein. I want to conclude by speaking out a very interesting machlokes between the Rav Moshe and Chazon Ish. You have a banana. You want to take a fork and mash the banana. So you're taking one entity and you're breaking it down. Is that grinding? Is that lush? We're going to see Be'ez Hashem next week, where to take small particles and to connect it together with a liquid. Let's say you have flour and you want to create dough, so you're going to mix it with water and now the flour is going to dissolve. That is lush. So can you take a banana or my favorite food, avocado? You want to smash it. Now I'm not talking about whipping it with lemon juice and mayonnaise. That's a separate shaila entirely. I'm just talking about mashing a vegetable where the natural juices of that vegetable will help form a mush. Rav Moshe has a very interesting tshuva. Rav Moshe says it's mutter. Wait a second. If I can cut a carrot into small pieces, why am I allowed to mash a banana? Says Rav Moshe that the definition of Tochein is only when you chop and you reduce an item into small pieces or small particles. However, if you're not reducing it to small particles, you're just changing it from a solid to a mush, that is not Tochein. It's a very big chiddush of Rav Moshe. The same thing would be with avocado. Or, in other words, according to Rav Moshe, a potato that's cooked, you want to mash it. It's not Tochein, because it's still a solid mass. It's not individual particles. And certainly, you could rely on the opinion of Rav Moshe Feinstein. The Chazon Ish, on the other hand, held this was the very definition, and this is the quintessential form of Tochein. This is the greatest example of Tochein, because you're breaking it down so completely that it's transforming. Now, if you want to be choishesh for the shita of the Chazon Ish, you want to mash a banana, or a potato, or avocado, you could do it with a shino, you could do it with the back of the spoon. But certainly, Rav Moshe's Kedai Lismay Chalav, you could rely on that is not considered Tochein. The definition of Tochein is to take an entity and break it down into particles. But according to Rav Moshe, mashing a banana or the like is not considered a violation of Tochein. Okay, so I have just two brief announcements to make. If anybody wants to help support the Shimru project, which is ultimately, they have a team of Talmidei Chachamim producing the material. It's going to be published as a sefer. If anybody wants to participate in this great project of Harbatzas Torah, please contact us. If somebody wants to sponsor a malacha in the sefer, please contact us. Also, tonight, there is a special event on Shas Illuminated. A review course on Hilchos Taras HaMishpacha, Hilchos Nida, focusing on Harchakos. It's 9 o'clock. You could get it on the Shas Illuminated website, or you could get it on this Zoom channel, or on our website, rabbidg.com. So if you live in Atlit, you only have to wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning if you want to catch it. If you live in Kew Garden Hills, 9 p.m. is a much more convenient time, but it will be available afterwards. So that's very important. And we're going to be discussing some of the laws of Taras HaMishpacha that are affected in the COVID era. Thank you everyone for joining. Bez Hashem, see you next week. Bracha v'atzlacha v'chol tov.
Excuse me, it's Tochein is just not applying just to vegetables. Doesn't it apply to all foods?
Okay, so Tochein applies to anything that grows from the ground. However, what the definition of that is, we didn't unfortunately get into that today. So
Smashing up tuna fish would not be a problem. Taking solid tuna and making it into tuna fish and making a sandwich out of it.
So, basically we say as follows, that generally if something doesn't grow from the ground, Tochein does not apply unless they're inedible. Inedible. Because if they're inedible, then grinding it improves it. So, in general, chopping up something that doesn't grow from the ground is okay unless it's inedible, and then you can't do it. So we gave an example. If you wanted to file metal, you couldn't do that. So, metal, you could make the case comes from the ground, but foods that grow from the ground are in a different category of Tochein. That's the category we spoke about today. Next week, Bez Hashem, we'll speak about possibly the tuna fish and the egg salad.
Rabbi, I know you spoke a lot about Israeli salad, which happens to be one of my favorite foods. And what I do
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.